Hi everyone, Plastic EP here, and I've got my very special guest, Michael Hill, author of the book, John Lennon, the boy who became a legend. And Michael was a school friend of John Lennon, and he's the one that actually turned him on to rock and roll. I mean, that's an amazing story in itself, Michael, isn't it?
Certainly is, Plastic EP. And
That's
the
it.
book telling you, I'm about to mail your book to you today.
Thank you, Michael. I can't wait to read it.
That's John Lennon, the boy who became a legend.
Fantastic. Now let me ask you a few questions, if I may. Growing up with John, we read a lot about him, right? Did you find him a bit of a scallywag? I'm just asking. Or was he just a normal kid? You didn't get up to much mischief, did you?
We got up to a lot of mischief, but that was at the beginning when I first met him, age 5. He was only 10 days younger than me, but he came to the school about 6 months later because he'd been at another school nearer to where he lived. But he'd actually been expelled at the age of 5 from that school, or asked to leave, because his parents had separated. His father abandoned him after the mother was, unfaithful. And then the mother had a new partner, and then she handed her little boy, 5-year-old, to her sister. So John lost his mother and her father, and pretty quickly after that lost his mother. And he was pretty, as you would imagine, like a little boy, he was pretty traumatized. So he had behavioral problems. So he was pretty wound up at the beginning, but he settled down at primary school. And towards the end of primary school became relatively pretty well behaved. And we went on to grammar school, and he was starting to play around. But what really sort of cut him loose and really changed his whole attitude to life was at age 14. And he was being brought up by his aunt and uncle, and his uncle was like a father figure to him. He was the only father he really knew. And this was Uncle George, and Uncle George suddenly died with no prior illness. I guess he had a heart attack or whatever. And he was here and then he wasn't here. And John was really pretty traumatized. He kind of lost all interest in schoolwork from that time. And then, because 3 years later, his mother died just when he was getting to know her. She was killed. So he had quite some trauma. But going back to behavior, during our teens, even as a young boy, John had a reputation around the neighborhood for being, being like a troublemaker. And some of the parents wanted to keep their kids away from him. And it's pretty interesting, because one of the boys who was at primary school with us, he was 1 year younger than us, and he lived at the house behind John Lennon's house. So these two little kids met over the back fence. This was Ivan Vaughan. And so when John and I passed the exam at age 11, we're going to go to grammar school. We were expecting 1 year later that Ivan would follow us, but he never did. He went to another school called the Liverpool Institute, which was in the city. We were going to Walton, which was in the suburbs. And the reason we found later that he never came to Quarrybank was that his father vetoed that choice of school. He didn't want his son to be in the same school with that John Lennon. They all referred to him as that John Lennon, And what made it really interesting is, so Ivan is now 1 year younger than us, and he's in the Liverpool Institute, pretty serious school in the city. He becomes friendly with a boy in his class who coincidentally was born on the same day, literally, same day, same year as him. And this boy was Paul McCartney. And Paul was much more musical. John wasn't musical at all. Paul was, because the father had been a musician. They had a piano at home. So he was into music. And when John finally, with a little push from me, when he really got into playing music and learning to play the guitar, he, he formed this skiffle group at school called the Quarrymen, and they were playing at the church fete in Woolton, and this famous meeting took place where John Lennon met Paul McCartney. They would never have met in all probability, or not for years. And they met because Ivan Vaughan, John's friend, brought this other friend, Paul McCartney, to meet John, because he said, hey, my friend has got a group and you should come along and hear them play. So this was a famous meeting when Paul, would you believe, played Long Tall Sally and a few other tunes to John. Because Paul could play the guitar when John couldn't. John was still, just learning to play. So, yeah, quite a lot of my book is about misbehavior. And John's best friend, Pete Sharpton, he was always very careful not to exploit his friendship with John. And he never commercialized on it. But when John was killed in 1980, a couple of years later, Paul, with the help of a journalist, wrote a book. And I discovered that book by chance when I was visiting Liverpool. It's called John Lennon in My Life by Pete Sharpton. And Pete writes all about the misbehavior of these two boys. It was so bad that I hid the book from my children. I didn't want them to read it in case they thought I was that bad, which of course I wasn't.
Can I ask you, Michael? I'll just ask you, you met Paul McCartney, obviously, and did you go to that fete that day?
No, unfortunately, I didn't. The fete took place already. We left school in July 1957, and I didn't even wait for the end of school. The minute I took my last exam on the Friday, on the Monday, I got a job in the city. I went to work for a brewery, not making beer, but working in the office. And John was still messing around. He was very lazy. And it's amazing that he got into the art school because, when we came to do the final exams at the end of school, the General Certificate of Education, we all sat the exams at the same time. And I was the only one of the four who passed anything. The other three failed every subject, the other three mates. So John really was, somebody had written on his school report, this boy is bound to fail, and he was going nowhere. And he got into art school, and at art school he was playing around just like he did at school, missing half the lessons, not taking it seriously. And I met him in the street one day, and, I said, how are you going, John? How's art school? He said, it's great, Mike. He said, I get paid for doing bugger all, which meant that he got a small grant, from the government. He thought that was great because he was basically lazy. But so I'm forgetting, what was the original question?
I just want to ask, when did you meet Paul McCartney?
Well, I really didn't know. I didn't know him. Going back to the fete, we'd left school, and I was already working, and I was already moving away from John. We were on different life paths. He was making a lot of new friends at the art school. So no, I didn't go. I would have gone, but I didn't know anything about it. So I missed out. I missed out on that fete. So what was the question again?
When did you meet Paul McCartney?
Hey, that's right. So we went to his, with my friend Don Beatty, we went over one afternoon. They were playing at Paul's house. And the they was because George Harrison was 1 year behind Paul at the same school. So he joined John's group, the Quarrymen, but they never had a drummer. So there are only three of them at this stage. So the three guitarists were practicing in Paul's house. So that was the first time I met Paul. But we didn't say hello. We went to his house. I think the front door was open, and there were already 2 or 3 other boys standing in the doorway. If you've ever been to that house, it's a very small house, Fourth Lynn Road, small, council house, very small room. So we kind of stood there and listened to the band, the 3 guys practicing. And the next time I met Paul was just when the Beatles were really taking off.
What
and
did
they
they
were playing
sound
them.
like? When you saw them at Fortland Road, what did they sound like when they were practicing?
They weren't much at all. You know, I mean, they was just singing a bit and strumming and practicing, but there was nothing too remarkable. We just thought it was remarkable that they were playing anything at all, because none of the rest of the boys were musical, you know, so we thought this was pretty impressive. I mean, John must have had some latent talent, but the only, you know, way that he showed this as a boy was to play the harmonica mouth organ. But a lot of boys played mouth organs. So he never had any, he said himself that he had no idea of doing music until he heard Little Richard. And that sort of changed his whole life, as I mentioned before. So
And that's
I
the
met
trigger.
Paul, but I didn't know Paul. But John I knew very well.
I was going to say, Michael, you know, that's the trigger, the Little Richard record that you played him. That's the trigger. That's why you turned him on to rock and roll.
Yeah, what I didn't mention about this record, that I discovered it by chance in Amsterdam. It had just been released in the US and in Belgium, but it was not released in the United Kingdom for almost one more year. So when I took that record back to England, I probably had the only copy in the whole country, you know. So, I mean, Paul McCartney picked it up later on, but he picked it up when it was released, and he would have heard it when it was released. That was, I think, about 9 or 10 months later. So John heard that, you know, probably before anybody else in England. It's just one of those, wasn't planned, it just happened. But it certainly made an impact on him.
Just amazing what you're telling me, because this early period, like the Beatles forming naturally, it's just amazing the stories you've got. Just tell me some other John Lennon stories, like during a day or something, did you guys go out and do something? Like, give me an idea what it was like with Pete as well, Pete Sharpton.
Well, when you read my book, you're going to be amazed. I just gave my book, copy of my book, to my granddaughter who's 13. She's going to be a bit shocked when she reads it about all the mischief her grandpa got up to when he was a boy. She has no idea. So there's a lot of stuff. I think it'd be better to read the book, really. There's a lot of funny things. It wasn't, I mean, John was misbehaving. He was a great shoplifter. It's a wonder he didn't seem to get caught shoplifting. But mostly what we did was mischief, nuisance value, but he didn't go around sort of kicking old ladies or anything like it. Wasn't serious stuff, but it was certainly serious nuisance. But he was good fun. We had such a lot of laughs in class. We used to sit together at the back of the class. That's probably why he didn't do very well, because he couldn't see. He really couldn't see the blackboard. He wouldn't wear his glasses. You never saw him wearing glasses, which he needed to wear. You know, it's ironic because when he became famous, he was wearing the granny, you know, what you call the granny glasses. And that's the sort of glasses that were prescribed free for children in England by the National Health Service. But he wouldn't wear his, because it didn't fit his image, that he wanted to project the image as a tough kid. But he wasn't really tough with his fists. He was tough with his language. You know, he could really cut people verbally, and he used to swear a lot. In the book, you'll see several mentions of the F word. And my wife said, "Michael, you can't put that in a book." I said, "You've got to put it in the book." He had it every sentence, F in this and F in that. That's how he was at 14 or 15. That was John Lennon. He was irreverent, you know.
Tell me, Michael, when you used to go to his house at Mendips with Aunt Mimi, can you tell me a few stories about that?
Yeah, I can tell you the story that I never got past the front door. John never invited people to his house. I think the only one who went in was Pete Sharpton, and he lived in the next street, the street behind. And they'd been friends since age 7. They saw each other all the time. But John liked to get out of his house. I think he couldn't wait to get out. It was a bit stifling. and Aunt Mimi loved him, but I think she was pretty strict. She never had any children of her own, and she used to be a mental health matron in a mental health home. So you can imagine she was a pretty tough cookie, I think, Aunt Mimi. So no, I never got past the front door. Same with Paul McCartney. He said he never got in the front door. You know, I went to Mendips about 7 years ago on the National Trust tour in Liverpool. And that was pretty amazing to go in John's bedroom. You've probably been on that tour.
No, I haven't, but I've seen it.
And John's bedroom was exactly the same as mine. It was above the front door, exactly, because he had a semi-detached house, so did I. His was slightly upmarket on mine, a little bit bigger, but it's the same design, same size bedroom. Yeah, very, very strange. You go to that house and because the bedroom's upstairs, and the only other door that's open upstairs is the toilet. The bathroom door is closed in the other two bedrooms. And the guide takes you upstairs with a small group. And I was the last, and they say no photographs. And I was the last one to go down. And I asked the guide, I said, is it okay if I just have a pee in the toilet, you know? They had he said they just lift the rope across. There was a rope across the door. So I had a pee in John's toilet, and it was exactly as it would have been when he was a little kid there, with the chain. You pull the chain, you know. And I thought, John, if you're looking at me from up there, wherever you are, you know, I never felt closer to John Lennon than having a pee in his toilet, where he lived, you know, because he lived in that house apart from a few months away when he was in the city. He lived in that house till he was 22, and he left Liverpool to follow his career path. And I left Liverpool at 22 to follow my career path. And he never lived in Liverpool again, and neither did I. And I ended up in Australia. Well, you know where he went. It's very strange, but there's a hell of a tragedy that his life was cut short at age 40. I mean, in a few months' time, God willing, I'll be 80 and he would have been 82. So he's lost half his life and more than half his adult life, 2/3 of his adult life.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've got to say, Michael, there's so many people love John Lennon, and just listening to your story, it touches the heart. What I want to ask you is, as you can appreciate, I'm born here in Australia and I understand the Australian lifestyle. But the great thing is, we've been aligned with England as a Commonwealth. So the things you tell me, I know that the period that you lived in was like a great period. Like when I mean great period, that was like me growing up even here in the 60s and having the kind of life and the kind of lifestyle that was a pure lifestyle. When I mean that, there wasn't many people, there wasn't many cars, there was a different kind of, how can I say, just different culture altogether. And I'm sure, for example, living up there in Liverpool when it was a bank holiday or when it was like a Saturday and you guys used to like get together, they must have been really fantastic, great days.
Oh yeah, and we played out a lot. You know, we didn't have TV. I didn't have a TV at home. He didn't have a TV, and you played outside. You know, in the fields and in the streets, and you were creative. You know, we used to make up our own games, and you no computers, and so we didn't get television until sometime later. So yeah, but in a way we were deprived. We still had rationing when we were little kids. You had to get little coupons. You know, you had a limit how much you could buy if you wanted to buy some chocolate or stuff like that. But you know what was really good in our teens is that we were there really at the beginning of the rock and roll period, and that was really exciting. The whole thing was changing in the night because from 1945, 1950, 55, the 10 years after the war were pretty drab, and the country was in a mess in England. They won the war, but they were bankrupt. So there was a lot of shortage of everything, a lot of rationing. But it started to change from the mid-50s, and this was a period of great liberation, I think, for children. Teenagers started to get money, buying power, and things really took off. It was exciting to to go through the sort of soft beginnings of rock and roll with Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, but then come in Little Richard. Wow, I mean, that's really in your face rock and roll the way he and it just led on to so many things. And the Beatles, well, it's just great. We were all the richer for the Beatles having existed and having created the body of music that they did create. They've left us a hell of a legacy.
Michael, during Beatlemania in 63, 64 in England, I'm just saying, did you cross paths again with John?
No, the sad thing is we'd seen him a couple of times at the Cavern at lunchtimes when they came back from Germany. The period that they had in Hamburg, the first period in Hamburg, was total change. That's what hardened them as musicians. They came back tough, not just tough physically, but tough in terms of stamina and much more creative. They had so much time. They were just playing night after night, hour after hour. So we saw them at the Cavern lunchtime, and I guess I would have been about 21 or 20 by then. And you felt ancient because the audience were mostly 15 and 16-year-old girls, But I'd been going to the Cavern since I was 16, but it used to be a jazz club to begin with. So then we saw them when they were really taking off. You know what happens? I mean, they suddenly get in the hit parade and they're getting on TV, but they've still got these bookings in local places which were made before they got famous. So, and then after that, you've got to see them in big theatres. And I saw John at that, spoke to John at that, he came off at the intermission. He'd been singing Twist and Shout, which was his hollering number that he used to sing. And Paul would do Long Tall Sally and John would do Twist and Shout. And he was wrecking his voice. I mean, he really shouted it out. And he was still smoking on stage. And he came off and spoke to us, and he could hardly talk. His voice was shot, But we spoke to him for about 5 minutes, wished him well. And that was the last time I saw him, because a few days after that, I started to work overseas. I was working with a company that I applied to go overseas. So I went off to Kuwait. I was half a year in Kuwait. And then I came 2 weeks and I went to Afghanistan. And I was 5 years in Afghanistan. By the time I came back, the Beatles had stopped performing. So I never saw the Beatles in a big concert venue, because they stopped there and they only had 5 years. Performing live was about 5 years, and then they were confined to the studio after that.
Michael, may I ask you, did you know anyone else? Did you know anyone else from other groups there, like Jerry and the Pacemakers or the Searchers, or anyone else was your friend?
No, we saw Jerry and the Pacemakers. You used to see them at the local dance halls, or sometimes we had a ship that used to sail up and down the River Mersey called the Royal Iris, and they had dance nights on this ship. So you'd know the bands, but I never knew them to talk to. So no, sadly, I have to say no. Just if I make one more comment about the impact this record had on John Lennon. So we're talking about 1956 in the back lounge room of my family house in Liverpool when he first heard this record. That by his own account, it changed his life, and he knew what he wanted to do, and he wanted to play music. So you go forward 19 years. I mean, 1956, they get famous, 63, 64. 69 already, they're breaking up. 71, he goes to New York, and he's not performing. He didn't perform for 4 or 5 years. And then he decided to come on stage, and there was a presentation concert at the Hilton Hotel in New York for Lou Grade, who was a famous impresario in London. So he was retiring, and they put on this big show for him in the Hilton Hotel. So they had a series of artists doing 2 or 3 numbers each. So they invited John Lennon. He did 3 numbers. And this was the last time that John ever performed on a stage. 1975. he might have come back on the stage, but 5 years later he was shot. So he did 3 numbers, and one of them, of course, was, and this is John Lennon, not the Beatles. So one of the numbers he did, you could imagine, was Imagine, his most famous single number. And one of the other 2 he did was the B-side of this record, Slippin' and a Slidin', the Little Richard record, which is not that well known. But the fact that John chose this out of all the tunes in the world that he could have picked, you know, his own and other people's, that he chose to include this in those 3 last numbers, to me it meant like it had gone full circle, 19 years, 1956, 1975. And that, in a way, that closed his performing career. You know, that was the same year, 75, that he did the rock and roll album, when he played, you know, and sang all the tunes that he loved when he was a 14 and 15, 16-year-old. And one of them on that CD, of course, is Slippin' and a Slidin', Peepin' and a Hidin'. It's all a long time ago. If you ever see the video of it, it's tremendous. Really good backing group, and you could see John Lennon really enjoying himself. He loved that rock and roll. Yeah.
I saw that, and he gave
amazing.
a message to everyone back home in England on that video.
Yeah, that's right. You're quite right. You've seen it. Bloody good performance. And the piano
Michael,
and the saxes. And,
exactly. Michael, I got to ask you, did you used to buy records at NEMS? And did you used to go with John in NEMS and listen to records before Brian?
No, I didn't, because at the time we're talking about, I mean, John didn't have a record player, didn't have any records. And I bought I'd been in NEMS a couple of times when I worked in the city. I started to work in the city at age, you know, just before 17. But I bought my records from the local record shop. You generally knew what you wanted. You went in and bought them. You know, they come in 78 RPM, and then the EPs started to come in, the 45s. We didn't call them EPs, we called them 45s. And but no, I didn't. See, John and I were starting to go on separate paths, and I mean, I was seriously working for my living. I joined an insurance company, marine shipping insurance, which became my career for my whole life. So I made a good career, but I worked, you know, and you climb up the corporate ladder. And John really, I have to say, hardly did one day's work, normal work, you know, in his entire life. So he was very talented, but also bloody lucky the way things happened. He was lucky that he met Paul McCartney. It's very much a case that 50-50 made 120. They were each the stronger for meeting each other. And of course, the backing of having George Harrison, tremendous guitarist behind them, they were made. But those two together, yeah, they really rubbed off each other, you know, with the music and the lyrics. And John had a great command of English. He was a good reader. He maybe didn't pass any exams, but he wasn't stupid, and he read a lot. And it gave him a good command of English, which came in very handy when he's songwriting. But Paul was clearly the stronger musician.
I'll just ask you, I read about John buying Pete Sharpton a grocery shop or something in 68 or 69.
Correct. Well, this is very interesting because, you know, Pete Sharpton and I, we were all really good friends at school. But after we left school, they came a couple of times to my house to parties. And but then we didn't see them after that. And, you know, I mean, Pete Sharpton, what the hell is he going to do? They've all come out of school with no exams. They're too old to be apprentices. Anyway, he became a police cadet, which we thought was pretty amazing because they never had a police record, but they came pretty close to it, you know, with shoplifting and mayhem around the neighborhood. Anyway, he became a police cadet, and he did 3 years in the police academy. He qualified as a policeman. Then he hated it, and he left, and he became the nighttime manager of a late-night coffee shop where he used to mix with a lot of crims. And he said, you know, that he could have easily gone on a life of crime. But John So he was kind of not going anywhere really with his life, and John starting to earn really money when the Beatles took off. And I know the story because I had a happy reunion with Pete Sharpton in Dublin in 2003, I think it was. And Pete had actually ended up making a hell of a lot of money finally. And he had a chain of restaurants in England, and he sold them for about £5 million. I told him, you have to leave the country for 3 years, otherwise you'll lose it all in tax. So I went to live in Dublin, and I met him in Dublin, and we had a great night together. And he told me, that evening, the story, how John, they were having a drink together, and John said, Pete, how you going? It wasn't going. He said, and he gave him £2,000, a lot of money, £2,000. That's when I was earning about £5 a week, £2,000 to just get him started in a business or something, And Pete told me the story, and he said, well, when he met John again a month or two later, he said, oh, how did you get on, Pete? What do you do with the money? Oh, John, he said, I pissed it all away. He drank it, in other words. And, many people would have given up on Pete at that point, but John didn't. But he didn't give him any money. He got his accountant to find him a business, and they bought him a small supermarket of England, which cost about £30,000. So that was a loan, but it was a loan without interest, and a loan which really probably was never going to be repaid. So that's how Pete got started running a supermarket business. Then later on, it became a restaurant business. And he told me that night, he said, I paid, and I think out of all his money he got from selling his business, he said, I paid, he paid Yoko Ono £30,000 that John had lent him, 30 years, no, more than 40 years before. All that time. Anyway, he repaid that debt. I think it was like a debt of honor. Not that Yoko needed the money, and John was dead, but he paid it. He made a point of telling me that he paid it. But
amazing stories, really Michael. Before we wrap it up, have you got another story you can tell us? One of your favorites. We've got to hear one of the best.
Well, some of them are pretty bad, but they're pretty embarrassing to read about, never mind to talk about. I think the mischief was pretty serious. I think you better read the book, really.
Okay, I'll do that, Michael. I actually can't wait for the book, but I need to ask you again. For the people that want to purchase the book, do you have the link with you there? You can tell us the link again.
Yes, you need to go to the website, and it's pretty easy to remember. It's www. And then John Lennon Legend as one word, johnlennonlegend.com, C-O-M. So it's johnlennonlegend.com, and that'll get the book. Anybody in Australia who wants to buy the book might prefer to email me because otherwise the book gets shipped out from the US. If they email me, I can mail them a copy. And my email address is Michael, M-I-C-H-A-L, michael.hill@bigpond.com. Pretty easy to remember, michael.hill@bigpond.com. Okay, thank you, Plastic EP.
Michael, I want everybody to go and buy that book because it's no point talking about something that's fascinating. I actually can't wait for my copy, and I'm so happy that you've signed it for me, and I can't wait to get it.
I'm going to the post office just as soon as we finish. I'm going to get my sneakers on and I'm off to the post office.
Thank you so much, Michael. Okay. From Plastic EP and Michael Hill, all the best, everyone. And to all the Beatle fans, we love you out there in the world. Stay safe. Talk soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks again, Mike.